Radical Christianity takes the words of Jesus seriously. And you can find the words of Jesus by going to your Bible and looking up the red letters. That's why we call this show Red Letter Christianity. I want you to meet a very dangerous person. Dangerous because this person is living out the red letters of the Bible, a follower of Jesus, carrying the radical message of Scripture into the streets, into the highways and byways of life. We have too few people who are doing it, but we have one of them for you to meet today. And you're crazy if you turn off your television right now, because you're about to meet somebody who will inspire you and maybe even change your life into being a red letter Christian. Count on it. Welcome. You're going to meet somebody extra special on this show today. It's my friend Chris Heuertz. I said it right.
You said it right.
Let me tell you, this guy is a true red letter Christian.
He really is.
If you're talking about going to those red letters of the Bible, the words of Jesus, and living them out, he's got it. And his friends have got it. They put together this movement called the Word Made Flesh. That's the name of their movement.
Is it really?
The Word Made Flesh. And what they really do is go into poor neighborhoods, particularly in third world countries. I believe they're working in 11 countries, but you can clarify that and get the exact number when he's...
And they go in and do...
Well, they move into these neighborhoods, and they literally become what the people in the neighborhood are like, economically, socially, dress-wise. They literally, you heard that word, incarnate. You know, earlier I talked on another show about...
the Word becoming flesh.
Yeah, the Word become flesh and dwell among us, and that Peterson translates that, and the eternal Christ became a human being and moved into our neighborhood. That's what they do. They move into the neighborhood, and they become part of the community and live out the love of Jesus, live out the red letters, sharing what they have. If the people are poor, they become poor. They give what they have to meet the needs of others round about them. They are a truly remarkable group of people.
And I'm interested in also asking about the human trafficking, because I've been to India several times and have been involved with some of that, and I'm absolutely... I'm really intrigued on what he's doing there. I'd love to ask him.
Well, India is one of the places where I think he's working. Human trafficking becomes a big concern of theirs because they're working among poor people in third world countries.
Yes.
And so often these poor people are pulled out of their roots and are trafficked. There's other stuff they're interested in. How do you like this? Contemplative action.
I know, and I saw that on his little bio. I was wondering what that was.
Yeah, because we live in a world where people who are contemplatives are over here, and activists are over here,
right,
and never the twain shall meet. Yeah. Are you going to be fascinated?
I truly am.
You're going to drill him on that one, aren't you? Yeah. And he also has some critiques of friendship evangelism that I think we all need to hear. Because so much of what goes on in our circles, in the evangelical circles, is manipulative. When we become friends of people, do we really become friends of people? Or are we just being friendly in order to get them to listen to our rip on the gospel and get them saved so we can have one more scalp on our belt?
Yeah, I kind of call that like this unholy manipulation.
Yeah. There's a lot of that going on.
Yes.
So he's going to talk about that. But... his ministry is really to the poorest of the poor in the world. And he and his wife, he's been married for several years, live this out. And they live in community. I read one of their books, and it was about friendship. I thought, I need to learn about friendship. Well, when I finished reading the book, I thought, geez, this is different than I thought it was going to be. It was, what does it mean to move into a poor community and really be friends with the people in that neighborhood? And he and his colleagues, I guess you would call them that, although that's too fancy of a word, and if there's anything he's not. And you're going to see that if there's anything he's not fancy. We use the word colleagues, but the guys and the women who work with him, they live together in community. You know what I mean by that. They share what they have. They live in a house together. They
Right, I
share
was
with
going
each
to
other.
say, if it is a house, is it?
Yeah, it is a house. Yeah,
Okay.
and houses all over the world where they have this, and like most Christian movements, he's not one of those guys that's running a Christian organization that's trying to raise money all the time. You know, I'm that kind of guy. We had on an earlier show, Leroy Barber. Poor guy's got to raise money because he's got 75 missionaries out there, kids that are working in urban areas, raising money all the time. This guy says, you know, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide what we need. In the meantime, we're not going to go around begging and become obligated to people who are playing these games. So if there's anybody,
I can't wait to ask how that
yeah,
happens then.
yeah,
How do they
you got to.
survive?
How do these guys survive? I mean, if red letter Christianity is disestablishment, it's opposed to the structures of society, and I believe Jesus was that way, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
When they put him on the cross, they didn't put him on the cross because he said, "Be nice and love everybody." It's because he upset the whole social fabric of his time.
Right.
I mean, you say be nice and love everybody, you end up speaking at Rotary clubs. You don't end up on a cross.
Right.
Well, this is the kind of guy that's going to end up on a cross. So I'm going to wrap it up right now. We're going to see a video so you can get a little taste of what he and what Word Made Flesh's movement is all about. So watch this.
A lot of our friends have legitimate reasons to question God's goodness. A lot of our friends pray prayers that seem to go unanswered. A lot of our friends in red light districts and enslaved in the commercial sex industry, I don't know where they find the resiliency to pray these prayers and continue to pray these prayers, but they do. And their experience of God isn't a good God. And so for us, I think evangelism is bearing witness to hope. And I think that's a really significant starting point when we're talking about evangelism. I don't know what God's vision for shalom is, but I feel like as I want to embody shalom in my marriage, in my community, in my vocation, that it looks like creating space, that it looks like affirming the divine imprint of God in all of humanity. I think it looks like bearing witness to hope. I think it looks like cultivating environments of peace and restoration. I think shalom is reconciling, and reconciling all things back to God, being reconciled with God. I think shalom is a celebration, and I think, you know, if one of the metaphors for paradise is this great banquet that God's preparing, and we're going to sit at this table and celebrate the goodness of the love of the divine, I think shalom is sitting at the table with friends. I think shalom is sitting at the table with people who are different than us. I think shalom is enjoying long meals and laughing and crying and being safe to be yourself, to be human, to be vulnerable. My sense about the eruptions of pain and injustice probably have to come back to the ability to offer and receive love, and it comes back to the best and the worst of our humanity, and you know, the shadow side of everything malforms the best of what it is. And I think if we're created to be vessels that receive love, that give love, that sort of channel love, when these things break and the jagged edges of the brokenness of us, we think we're loving and we're not. What we're doing is we're loving ourselves. I think we are being drawn towards wholeness, and I think when you look at the world, things are getting worse. Like, we're finding more disgusting and cruel ways to exploit humanity and vulnerability and weakness, and I think we're finding new ways to hurt and to harm people, and you know, it's not a safe world for vulnerable women and children. It's not a safe world if you're broke. It's not a safe world if you're not part of the dominant consciousness, if you're the wrong ethnicity in a space where the ethnic majority is leading with fear and power and control. I would say that it's the resiliency of our friends that give me hope. It's the faithfulness of their prayers. And you know what? They're prayers for us. They're prayers for themselves, that our prayers prayed spaces that don't seem like those prayers are going to get answered. And you know, it's the vibrancy of the child who's experienced trauma and loss and pain. It's that kid's laughter that reminds me it's okay to laugh. And it's a generosity of my friends who are poor that teaches me how to be generous. You know, I mean, it's like some of the poorest people I know are the most generous. They throw the best parties. They prepare the best meals, the meals that they can't afford to serve. And so it's folks who've suffered, it's folks who've lost a lot that still have hope, that teach me how to hope, and they teach me it's okay to hope.
Hey, Chris, just from watching you speak on the video and just reading about some of what you're doing, when was the first time, I look at you and I'm listening to you and I go, there had to be a point in his life when there was a turn from one perspective to the other as far as the gospel and the Lord and talking about love and hope. When was that, and what did it look like?
I feel like probably in all of our lives there's a series of conversions, and a lot of these conversions in this series of sort of awakening happen in relationships, and so I feel like there's these echoes of sort of vocational exploration that just marked my childhood and my adolescence. I would say when I was a university student, I spent some time studying in Jerusalem, and it was down in the Hinnom Valley kicking a soccer ball around with some Palestinian refugee children that I felt like I started to have my eyes open to the difference between some of the eruptions of poverty that I've seen in North America versus the kinds of oppression and repression that I've seen in other parts of the world. Shortly after that, I ended up going to India and ended up meeting Mother Teresa.
You worked with Mother Teresa for a while, didn't you?
I probably sat with Mother 15 times before she died. And on my first visit there, in my first 2 months, carried 50 dead bodies out of her house for the dying. And I think at that point, I was wrecked. And I think at that point, it's as if vocation found me and wouldn't let go.
Word made flesh. Could you flesh that out a little more for us? How many young men and women or older men and women are together in this movement with you?
Yeah. There's about 250 of us in sort of the embrace of the collective. We're in 13 cities in 11 countries around the world. And sort of vocationally, we're called and committed to bearing witness to hope. And I use that language very intentionally because we still have hope that God is good in a world that has legitimate reasons to question God's goodness. And so we do this very, very incarnationally in the neighborhood, on the streets, in the sewers and slums, in and around the red light districts and refugee camps, working primarily with women and children.
You're going to have to establish a group down in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, because we have some of our people from my organization working down there, and the despair that has overcome Port-au-Prince because of the earthquake. 300,000 people wiped out. The buildings all collapsed. The helplessness that people feel. There is an absence of hope. Of all the things I find in Port-au-Prince. I mean, they had an earthquake in Christchurch. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, Christchurch, New Zealand. They had an earthquake. But, people got killed and buildings collapsed, but you could just see they're going to have that place back into shape in 5 years. But I'm not sure about Haiti because the hope is gone. How do you generate hope?
Yeah, well, we also sort of understand our vocation as contemplative activism.
Whoa, that's heavy language. Contemplative activism.
Yeah.
I'm sure that most of our listeners
Explain.
have a clue as to what you mean by that.
Well, and I'll explain that because I think that's what fuels the absurdity of throwing ourselves at hope. Yeah. When we started this, and actually We're Made Flesh will celebrate its 20th anniversary this fall, we thought that community would sustain this. But
living together as brothers and sisters.
Well, when we talk about community, we don't mean commune. We don't actually all live together.
All together, right.
In fact, we don't worship together. We're an ecumenical community of Catholic and Protestant, evangelical and Orthodox Christians. But we consider the table a space, a real sacramental space of unity, right? And I say the table sacramental because it's one of the metaphors of paradise, and we yearn for that. We yearn for that safety where we break bread together, where we can be ourselves and celebrate together. So we thought community would sustain us, but you know, communities transition, and the communities that you're part of now, if it's your worshiping community, the place you work,
Turnovers.
It's the turnover. It's every 3, 5, 7 years, it's a different group. And so we realize community will incubate our vocational imagination, but it's the contemplative that will sustain us.
What do you mean by contemplative?
And so what do I mean by contemplative? Yeah, you know, when I was a university student, I read a stack of Merton books, and I thought I understood it.
Thomas Merton.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think what we mean by contemplative in Where May Flesh is really a posture of consent. And what that allows for is for God to be God, where we don't fill the space with words, where we're not asking, expecting, but in the silence we receive the gifts and the mysteries.
Yeah. I do contemplative praying, you know, where I say nothing. You know, they asked Mother Teresa once, when you pray, what do you say to God? She said, I don't say anything, I listen. So then Dan Rather says, okay, when you pray, what does God say to you? She says, God doesn't say anything. God listens. And if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you.
It's amazing. And silence is so much.
That's,
It's so missing from our lives and our culture. We don't take the time to be quiet. But let me ask you this, Chris, because there's so many people in the church and Christendom that are, let's use the word, in a community or in an organization, trying to, quote, do for God. And they are out there trying to raise funds to do for God. And from what I've learned, you're not even trying to do that. You're not trying to you're not raising any monies to get where you're going or to sustain you. And I'm intrigued on how do the 250 people live with families, with children? How do you guys sustain yourself?
Well, we do have about a $2 million budget. And
where does that come from?
It actually comes from folks who give about $30 to $70 a month, hopefully 8-10 times a year. We've hardly in 20 years related to sort of big donors or foundations, but we've really tried to build sort of a grassroots movement towards hope. And so there's a lot of ownership, and there's a lot of different kinds of folks who make sacrifices. And the irony of it is they make sacrifices so the folks who are part of our community can make sacrifices.
Gotcha.
So we live lifestyles that reflect respect for people who are poor. And we have a needs-based salary structure. So our regional coordinator for Europe, Africa makes less than the cook at one of the drop-in centers that we operate. And we try to do this in a way that's sensible, but I think that also
is that having to do
honoring.
with children and family and what the needs are personally? Yeah.
So.
you know, communism, as articulated by Marx, is a cheap imitation of what Jesus willed for us. In the 2nd chapter of Acts, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That did not come from Marx. That comes from Luke in the book of Acts. And when I read the book about your friendship book, I was so impressed by that. I was impressed by the fact that where you tell that one story about this guy who's head of this big wealthy foundation, and you become friends with him, and he's waiting for you to make the hit. When are you going to ask me for money? And you never do. And that impressed me. And I don't know whether he ever gave you money, but he finally got so irritated that he asked you, when are you going to ask me for money? But I was impressed that being his friend was more important than getting his money.
Well, yeah, I think just like we don't want our friends commodified for their sexuality, I also think we don't want to commodify people who we believe are simply access to opportunity or resource. And I think when we do that the wrong way, we diminish everyone's humanity in those exchanges.
When we were together in December, you talked a little bit about your interest and the interest of your community in human trafficking. How does that play out in the life of Word Made Flesh movement?
Yeah, we have a few of our international projects actually focus on women and children who are caught up in the commercial sex industry. One of them is in Calcutta, and we're working in some of the most notorious red light districts in South Asia. What we've done is we've created a cooperative where women who are in the neighborhoods and women who've been trafficked are being trained to stitch really beautiful purses and scarves, but ultimately really gorgeous quilts. And they make these out of old, ratty, used-up saris, recycled saris, the traditional dress worn by Indian women. And the idea of it was that something that is tossed aside or dirty or worthless could could not simply be made beautiful but valuable. And so there's a real prophetic edge to the symbol of restoration.
That is prophetic, because if there's anything that Jesus says about himself, that he's the stone which the builders rejects, and he becomes the cornerstone for the whole new world.
And to see the hope and the light of Christ in these women, like I've gone several times, and I've met when they're 18, they've already been there 10 years, but they come out, and the countenance and the life, talk about hope and light and the difference Jesus makes. I so respect what you're doing, Chris. Talk about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, no.
No, I was going to ask about, before you came out here, you were talking about centering. I was interested in what you were talking about that.
Well, we talk a lot in our community about the false centers, and I think this is one of the ways that we do violence to human identity. And when folks ask, how does it that little kids are getting climbed up on top of 10, 12 times a day in these red light areas, it starts, I think, with things that seem very subtle or very nuanced. And so it talks, for us, we want to talk about what does it look like to dismantle the false center. And usually we are our own false center. And so if we're talking about our Muslim friends or our black friends or our gay friends or whatever, we almost always use these qualifiers that are externalized.
Like what?
Like what we're not.
I see.
And so I would never call you my white, straight Protestant friend, Tony.
Yeah.
But we use these qualifiers to describe the so-called other. And I think when we start to use language like that, that's the first step towards violence against identity.
You know, Erving Goffman, do you ever read Erving Goffman? Brilliant sociologist and anthropologist, talks about labeling theory and basically says that labeling does exactly what you said, violence to people. For instance, you get a kid who gets arrested and he goes to jail for 6 months. He is labeled. He is a criminal. From that point on, he defines himself in terms of his label and forgets who he really is. And so often we allow the labels that other people lay on us to define us.
Right, and so when we talk about friendship evangelism being a betrayal of friendship, it's because I think a lot of good-hearted, sincere, and earnest Christian folks have labeled and reduced people to potential converts. And I do think that is a perpetuation of this violence against the divine imprint of God in all of our humanity.
There's a wonderful story, I'll bet you use it, where Jesus goes across the Sea of Galilee and he meets this demonic possessed man. And I mean, here's this guy ripping and tearing his body apart. And the first question he asks is, what's your name? Who are you? And the guy doesn't even know who he is. I'm Legion. I'm many. I've gotten so many labels from so many different people. And you want to know who I really am. And I guess that's part of what you're driving at, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the affirmation of the divine
in the other.
In all
well,
of
you
us.
just said it's really powerful. You know, we deduce people to potential converts. I have found that people are failing just in simple things, to look people in the eyes, to be inquisitive about them, respect them, learn about them. We're wanting to push, you know, taking the fire hose. God, Jesus!
Yeah.
You know, instead of really finding out about someone.
Jesus, who looks at his disciples and says, you're my friends. And I guess in the end, that's what Word Made Flesh is about. People in 11 different countries moving into poor communities and saying, you're my friends. It's as simple and as profound as that. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Chris.
I appreciate you.
Thanks for sharing yourself with us.
It's good to see you.
You know, Tony, on all these different shows we've been doing with these incredible people living out red letter Christianity, I think it would be so, when I think about some of the rawness and the trueness and I mean, you're getting to, you know, you're having people that are just, you know, not consumed with any materialism, anything that the average bear would be consumed with. I think it would be easy to be a person that would say, be easy to be judgmental in the people that don't live that way. I mean, don't you think on either side it could be hard to give into judgmentalism?
It would be very easy for these red letter Christian young people who are trying to live out those red letters of the Bible to become holier than thou.
Holier than thou, exactly.
We don't buy into the materialism and the consumerism of the world.
Right.
I have to tell you this. In our group of red letter Christians, when these guys and women get together, about 50 of them, the overwhelming theme is You don't understand, you people on the outside. We do this because we enjoy it. It's fun. What we don't understand is why people who are into the consumeristic culture of the society and are so unhappy don't get it. That this is not the kind of stuff that will really gratify the deep longings of your soul. You've been sold a bill of goods, and it hasn't made you happy. We haven't given up happiness and joy. We have found it in getting rid of these things. Jesus said, whosoever seeks to save himself will lose himself. But whosoever is willing to save himself for my sake and the sake of the gospel will find himself. And these people are saying, you know, we're not judging you and saying you're unholy. We're saying we're having a wonderful time. Come join us. We're going to have many times on this show Shane Claiborne. The title of his book is The Irresistible Revolution. Once you get a taste of this carefree life, and Jesus says, live a carefree life. Take no thought for tomorrow, what ye shall eat, what ye shall drink, and wherewithal ye shall be clothed. After all of these things that the Gentiles seek. That's the carefree life that Jesus calls us to.
I think what all of them do is, and I pray for the people listening, as it has done for myself, is make you look at your own life. Yes. And where is that for you? Where is that center for you with the Lord as far as how you're supposed to reach out and live?
That word centering was a big one, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, he brought up human trafficking. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there are more people who are slaves today in the world today than at any other time in human history.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
We think that slavery has been abolished. Take Haiti, small country, earthquake. Do you know that there are 300,000 children who are slaves in Haiti? 300,000 in this country of 9 million. They're called restaveks. These guys go into the hills, go to these poor mothers who have 8 or 9 children, say you can't feed them. Give us 2 of your
we'll
children.
take care of them.
We'll take care of 2 of the children, take them into the city. They give them to families to be domestic servants. They're beaten, they're humiliated. If they're girls, they probably get raped. It's horrible. And we've got to stand up against slavery.
Yes.
And they're doing it. They're doing it at the grassroots, creating jobs for these people. You just can't say, you got to stop doing this. You got to create something that'll enable them to make a living in their place.
Like most of them are, what I've learned too is really not, they're going into the environment.
Yeah.
They're going into the communities.
That's
they're
right.
getting up and moving. Like you said, that's 90% of the power of it is showing up.
When I read Chris's book, I thought to myself, whoa, I need to pay attention to this movement. And that's why we got him into the Red Letter Christian movement, because he is a true Red Letter Christian. Now, if you want to learn more about Chris and Word Made Flesh and the movement, you may even want to become part of his movement. Move into a third world country. Live with families that are poor. Live out the gospel. If you want to do that, go to the website, redletterchristians.org. Number 1 on the list is a television show, and you can collect all the information about these ministries that we've been going over week after week. So do it. Live out the gospel. Become a Red Letter Christian yourself. Keep the faith. Hear me? Keep the faith.